So in 2015, HESI spent a tremendous amount of money to convene the world-leading expert in genetic toxicology to actually create a new generation testing strategy for the assessment of genomic damage. And these experts have tried to translate like a lot of the new technology into really an assessment of human risk, and then to translate that to human populations. So what is the Clean Sheet Project? The The Clean Sheet Project is genetic toxicology testing strategy designed from a clean slate, so incorporating new science and technology. The strategy evolved to entail a more flexible approach to allow for greater diversity of genomic damage to be addressed. And why was it done now? The reason why it was done now is that there were a number of technology advances and improvements in systems biology that actually make that somewhat more possible. And if you take some of the industries, like in the pharmaceutical industry, that's already practiced even in a regulatory setting. So in order to make this paradigm shift in risk assessment, it requires really a change in a paradigm shift in the mindset. So if you look at the genetic toxicology battery, genetic toxicologists were so arrogant to believe that you can actually run 3 different assays and predict whether or not a compound is going to be carcinogenic to a human population. And so usually what we just did was a mutation assay, the Ames assay, some mammalian in vitro assay to assess clastogenicity and endogenicity, and then do some little in vivo test to go and say like, is metabolism, ADME properties of the compound involved in the assessment of genetic toxicology. So, but that's definitely not true. So the Clean Sheet Project was sent out to develop a conceptual framework for a next generation gene tox testing strategy. The key principles of that strategy before it even was started is that you don't start with an assay. So what I mean by this is like, so rather than starting with a standard battery of assays, you upfront look at like what compounds are you testing, and start with a compound first. So instead of just focusing on a small set of genetic damage, mainly mutations, breakage, and aneuploidy, the intent was to also look a little bit more broader and go and say, does genetic toxicology have a role in epigenetics testing or in things like copy number variances? And again, if you know that gene tox in the past, they didn't really care about exposure. It was pretty much a plus-minus assessment. And we wanted to have this a little bit more exposure dependent. So what we really try to do is go from a strict hazard identification and the dichotomous positive negative evaluation of test results that was solely focused on determining whether or not a compound has carcinogenic potential, which led actually to quite a bit of like unnecessary in vivo follow-up testing and the unnecessary use of animals, to a much more flexible approach that actually looked first at the risk assessment question that you want to ask, provides actually mode of action information about the chemical, and actually shifts towards a more quantitative dose response analysis and point of departure determination. And the goal was really to inform genotoxic risk at relevant human exposures rather than the high concentrations that are used in gene tox assays. To put this into a little bit more different framework, and this is stolen from Thomas Hardung, the goal was to move from a phenomenological gene tox where we just exposed cells in vitro, then something magically happened in those cells, and we ended up with some type of genotoxic hazard that we could measure, i.e. micronuclei, mutations, or aneuploidy. So in this case, the causality that this is a cancer-inducing agent was just supported by that correlation by being positive in these assays. The goal is really to get to a mode of action genotox where you really identify what is actually in that black box. What is the molecular target that is responsible for the effect? What are the sequences of cellular events? What is the dose response? Are there any defense mechanisms that make some populations more sensitive than others? And then define the risk based on predicted in vivo exposure. In this case, the cancer risk would be supported by a mechanistic understanding of the compound. And so based on this, the team came up with a framework of 9 distinct steps. And these are pretty much like risk assessment steps. The first part is planning and scoping, which is pretty much means just like, what is really the risk assessment question that you want to answer? And that might be different for an environmental exposure than it is for a human exposure to a pharmaceutical. And so one of the big factors is then to determine what is actually the expected exposure. And again, that can be for pesticides very different, whether or not you ingest something that was exposed to the pesticide or if you're a pesticides worker. So then you build your knowledge base, and based on the knowledge about the compound, you develop a rational biological argument and select the assays and perform them. Then you go and review your results, and that might actually feed back into your planning and scoping and building your knowledge base. So then you go on to select your appropriate point of departure metrics, which pretty much means like assessing dose response relationships, estimate acceptable levels, and then do a full risk characterization. So that's very different from the standard plus-minus approach that has been used in genotox. So let's go over some of these points. So build the knowledge base. The question again is like, what are the intended uses? What are the biological targets? So for example, in pharmaceuticals, we pursue kinase inhibitors. And they are inherently different than a lot of the other molecules that we pursue just based on their cell biology. What are the physical-chemical characteristics of the compounds of interest? Do we have any structure-activity relationship information? Can we do a read-across to figure out if the chemical structure poses any risk? So do we have any toxicokinetic information? And that is probably one of the biggest problems, is that most of the time for many chemical entities, there is no toxicokinetic information. Do we have tested similar compounds, and do we know what their mode of action is? Do we have any other existing results from toxicology studies? Do we, for example, know whether or not these compounds interact with other receptors? Do we have any existing human data and other factors? So rather than starting to test, you actually first look at the compound, see do we have anything that we know about it. So then you select the assays and perform them. And the goal is here, in these assays, is to start with a genetic effect, because that's usually the test that you do, but also trying to understand what is the cellular effect and what is the molecular target. And if you look at this, it's pretty much like an adverse outcome pathway for that genetic event. So to give you a little example, so for, tubulin poisons usually induce micronuclei and polyploidy and chromosomal breakage. What they do in the cell is they induce abnormal mitotic spindles, induce mitotic arrest, mitotic slippage, and caspase activation, which is actually responsible for the clastogenicity of these compounds. And then once you know that, we know that, for example, these compounds interact with the mitotic spindle and disturb microtubule function. So this is what we call like a mini AOP. And that's really what we want to get to, and we should have enough technology to actually get there for individual compounds. So then if you look at like dose response metrics, so we have a whole group, a quantitative group that actually specifically deals with this. So if you look at like the dose response there, you see like these little triangles and some lines that are green, which is pretty much represent the response in the assay and the variance of that assay. And now you can do this and go on do dose response modeling to find the best fit for the curve. You can do an upper and lower limit of the estimation, and then you can actually predict how much of an effect do you get predict at what concentration. And that's really what the whole rationale is. So rather than now focusing on plus and minus, you're telling people up front, this is how much effect we would expect at what concentration. And once you understand that, you can actually do an estimation of acceptable levels and risk characterization. A lot of these assays, you can do POD metrics for a variety. Chemicals don't usually do one type of effect. They do actually usually many things. And you can determine these PODs, point of departures, for a lot of different compounds. And then you can compare that with the exposure and develop a margin of exposure or a reference dose approach. So, and this can be easily adapted to any toxicity, as we know, and it really directly incorporates estimated or actual human dose information. So, in summary, the current GeneTox battery is solely focused on hazard identification. The dichotomous results lead to unnecessary loss of valuable compounds, because again, if you're just putting them into plus minus and you throw away anything that produces any response, and again, GeneTox assays are tested up to 1 millimolar. Not a good thing. So you lose a lot of good compounds, and it leads to a lot of unnecessary in vivo follow-up testing. And again, most of the time we have very minimal mode of action information. So the proposed next generation testing strategy is focused on human risk assessment. It's a flexible approach, identifies the mode of action information for genotoxicity, and uses quantitative risk assessment, really. As you might have noticed, this is one of the first presentations I've given without any data. And there's a reason for that, because right now this is just a theoretical framework. And the problem is, and it was, I think, rightfully pointed out during the review, is without any data, nobody can really understand how it actually works. And so the next thing is to actually publish case studies to demonstrate the applicability of the strategy into different sectors. So we have chemical industry, we have cosmetics, we have the pharmaceutical industry. And there are enough examples where we can actually create exactly that framework retroactively to show like how that actually could work. And the key question is, in this case study, what type of information is needed to address a particular regulatory question, and what is actually a minimal data set? Because again, we have data-rich examples, i.e. pharmaceuticals, where you know a lot about the compound, and we have some really data-poor example from the chemical industry up front, where there's not really a lot of information available, especially about the exposure. So, and then we want to promote this strategy away from just sole hazard identification towards a more risk assessment approach. So I also want to acknowledge, so I had really nothing to do with this work group. I'm just here to present it. And so I want to acknowledge Carrie Deerfield and Bhaskar Golapudi and Miriam, who have put a lot of work actually making this work, and who has ever worked with genetic toxicologists know it's not really easy to develop a consensus among genetic toxicologists. And I also want to really recognize Jennifer and Diane, who are sitting in the back, who actually have helped the team to actually come to a consensus. And Chen actually has edited my slides and made them much better than they were before. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Questions, comments?
Oh no.
This is more of a comment than a question. So back in the day, there were a lot of non-immunologists that asked us, immunotoxicologists, for the 1 to 3 screens that we're going to cover and predict all immunotoxicology. And we tried to educate them and say, no, that just can't be done. And they would say, but look at genotox. So I think this is really refreshing, because you're going to, it looks like you're going to more of a weighted evidence, science-based, human risk.
Yep.
Very entertaining discussion.
Thank you. Yeah, it's actually true, because when we originally started doing GeneTox, and you can look at the papers related to it, on average, between 25 and 30% of all compounds that you test are going to be positive in these assays. So if you throw them all away, and if, for example, if you're in the drug development industry, you just lost 30% of your compounds. We now know from like extensive, we actually do mode of action studies and other things, that the real number is probably more like 3% of the compound that you really should throw away. And so that's a huge difference once you start getting more into this type of assessment. So many compounds are not dangerous under the exposure scenario they're intended for.
There are Ruth, please. Just in time.
Just going to ask, you mentioned the tubulin-based mechanism. Do you think it's plausible to start working our way through the known genetic toxins and start to categorize them and say, is there a finite number of AOPs or targets? And then what are the ones that don't fit and start to really categorize them so that you can then work backwards to order them, as you said?
I think it is for a large number of molecules really possible to do this, and we actually have created in the GTTC a mode of action work group that's actually part of the mission is going to develop mechanistic AOPs. For example, what happens with a tubulin inhibitor, what happens with a topo-2 inhibitor, topo-1 inhibitor, oxidative damage inducer, direct acting bulky adduct compound. And I think it is possible to do it because the technology has become better. We now have really great progress in the area of toxicogenomics, of cell biology, proteomics. I mean, I think we can much better understand what is actually what's going on in a cell.
Thank you very much indeed.